Hello, world. A few years ago, I started a journey asking the question of what makes a Japanese person Japanese. Why would I, a Canadian, spend a couple years delving into Japanese identity? Well, my wife is Japanese, which makes our kids both Japanese and Canadian. In Japanese, they're known as Hafu because one half of them is Japanese, so that kind of implies that they're not fully Japanese. In Canada, they can call themselves Japanese Canadian, half Japanese, half Canadian, or simply Canadian. Because, as Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau so eloquently put it,
A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, and the diversity of our country is actually one of our greatest strengths.
take me for example. I've always called myself Canadian, but if you trace back my ancestry, I'm also lots of things. My father is of Chinese descent, but his family moved to Guyana over 100 years ago when they came over as indentured laborers. They'd been there so long that my father's sole language is English. And can I pause on this picture for a second and say that I've never thought of my father as a stylish guy, but man, he's looking pretty slick along with the rest of my aunts and uncles. But on to my mother, who is mostly British but was born in Belize. I say mostly because recently she found out she has some indigenous Central American mixed in, which means I do as well. Anyways, she grew up all over the West Indies with her family, and after marrying my father in Guyana, promptly moved to Canada and they became Canadians. Despite their varied backgrounds and having moved to Canada in their 20s, they could easily call themselves Canadian. I was born in Canada, so that makes me a Canadian, and no one has ever questioned if I'm Canadian or not, despite having such an eclectic background. My wife's story is much simpler. She was born and raised in Tokyo, and her family has lived in Japan for as far back as they can remember, with some claims to samurai lineage even. And, like me in Canada, no one in Japan has ever questioned if she's Japanese or not. But our kids, they are both Japanese and Canadian. So why is it, in Canada, if they call themselves Canadian, people won't question them? Whereas in Japan, if they call themselves Japanese, it's not accepted so easily. Perhaps it's because there are people like the former Prime Minister of Japan, Aso Taro, who have proclaimed that Japan is one nation, one civilization, one language, one culture, and one race, the like of which there is no other on this earth. So that got me thinking, what makes a Japanese person Japanese or not? Is it the blood that runs through their veins? A parent they were born to? The country they grew up in? Is it how they look? How they act? How they speak? To seek answers, I went to the far north, Hokkaido, to talk with the Ainu people who have lived on the land for thousands of years. I went to the far south, Okinawa, who've had many influences, from Chinese to American to Japanese. I went all over Japan and met with Zainichi Koreans, whose families came to Japan from Korea generations ago. Nikkei Brazilians, who returned to Japan after generations away. Hafu, who have one Japanese parent and a strong connection to one another. Kikokushijo, who grew up partly outside of Japan and often feel like outsiders upon returning. Refugees, who may have been born and raised in Japan but can struggle to attain citizenship. And I met with naturalized Japanese, who became Japanese later in life. I met with all kinds of Japanese, who are Japanese, but it's complicated. So I went out asking the question, what is being Japanese?